Welcome to Vermont's Voice. I'm Jordan Hayden. We don't usually put out 2 episodes in a week, but we have some urgent breaking news out of Washington that could not wait until our next episode. So today, we'll be doing a special of sorts on the latest attack on climate from the Trump administration. Now, earlier this week, President Trump issued yet another executive order, this time specifically targeting Vermont's climate Superfund law, along with similar climate and clean energy policies in a few other states. Now, let's be clear. This is an attack on our state's right to protect our people from the devastating costs of the climate crisis. And it's no secret why Trump is doing this. Just a few weeks ago, he hosted a pack of big oil executives at the White House. They discussed ways that he could help this polluting industry escape taking any responsibility for the harm that they have caused. The Washington Post covered the meeting and included this assessment from VPIRG's own Paul Burns. The idea that the companies who bear responsibility are now scheming with the president in order to avoid being held accountable is sickening. For those whose homes were washed away, whose farms were destroyed, it's the worst kind of insult to injury. So, are we surprised that this president is standing with billionaire oil executives over Vermont farmers, small businesses, and families reeling from climate disasters? No. But here's the good news. He won't get away with this. We know this may be news to the president, but the Constitution does not in fact give the president the power to strike down the state law with the stroke of a pen. As Vermont's Attorney General Charity Clark put it to Vermont Public earlier this week, as we all learned in elementary school, it is the courts who interpret the laws. Congress passes the laws, and the executive branch, the president, carries out the instructions of Congress. Vermont's law was carefully crafted to withstand the challenge from the oil industry or the Trump administration. It appears the industry is getting very worried that they will finally have to pay for the damages that they've caused, rather than sticking Vermont homeowners and taxpayers with the bill. So, we'll keep you posted as this moves along. To discuss the issue in more detail, I sat down with Edgerly Walsh, VPIRG's Climate and Energy Program Director, and Anthony Iarrapino, a lobbyist working with the Conservation Law Foundation. This interview was recorded before Trump's executive action. All right, Ben, Anthony, welcome to the podcast.
So great to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. Ben, you're sort of an old pro at this because you've been on the set before. Yeah, that's a big deal. You're an expert. Anthony, this is your first time here, so I appreciate you making the trek from the State House. Hopefully you like our little setup here.
I love your setup as a sustaining member. I recognize many of the placards and successful campaigns from years past. So It's great to be surrounded by that energy as we push forward with the Make Big Oil Pay campaign.
For sure, you get to reflect a bit. It's great. Well, I'm really eager to talk to you both about Vermont's new climate Superfund law, because while you do both work at different entities, Ben, obviously you're with VPIRG, Anthony, you're with CLF, you obviously work very closely together and collaborate on this issue, and so I think it'll be really great to get both of your perspectives today. So before we get into that, just a quick reminder for our listeners here, just at the most basic level, Vermont's Climate Superfund law aims to ensure that big oil and gas companies with footprints in the state of Vermont are held financially accountable for their fair share of the climate crisis. Again, that's sort of the most basic level. There's a lot more to say. I'm sure you're both planning to say it, so I think we can just go ahead and get started if that sounds good.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
So Anthony, I'd like to start with you. Now, with so much to tackle in the state of Vermont, I'm wondering how you can convince the necessary stakeholders that this new law in particular remains both extremely important and urgent.
Yeah, well, the sad reality is that if you look at communities across the state, we're seeing climate damages and the costs that they impose on municipal budgets, state budgets, households, farms, small businesses mount with each passing year. We had the devastating floods in 2023, and then almost exactly a year to the day, many of the same communities or their neighbors hit very hard. Reporting in a recent edition of VT Digger sort of sums it up. Floods long past, but towns are swimming in red ink. We're seeing the damages overwhelm municipal finances for things like repairing roads and bridges, repairing wastewater and drinking water infrastructure. People are still waiting for money from FEMA and FEMA buyouts. At the same time, even before the change in administration, FEMA was incredibly unreliable as a funding partner. And now with all the chaos that's happening at the federal level, just this week, the president and members of his cabinet saying that they're going to eliminate FEMA. We know that the costs of climate change, and they go well beyond flooding, are going to be tremendous. They have been tremendous, and they're more than Vermonters can bear alone. So the idea behind the Climate Superfund that we would look to responsible parties, some of the world's largest and most profitable fossil fuel corporations whose products and activities are at the root cause of the climate crisis, who knew for decades that their products and activities, they didn't make a change, were going to result in the kind of damages that Vermont is sustaining and the kind of conditions that's going to cost us billions of dollars to adapt to. It's only fair to look to them to contribute to help make sure that Vermont taxpayers, Vermont communities, Vermont small businesses are not the only ones paying the cost to repair the damage that their activities have created so many profits for. So I think when people look around, it sums up in a recent quote from the Barton town clerk. It was in some VPR reporting about that town's recovery from extreme climate-related disaster. And she said, I never used to stay up in the morning or stay up late at night wondering where the money is going to come from. And now most nights at 3 a.m., I am awake wondering where's the money going to come from. And our message is a fairly simple one. It's not going to be all the money, but the fair share needs to come from the fossil fuel, world's largest and most profitable fossil fuel corporations.
Absolutely. And what a powerful quote. Thank you for sharing that. And for also just giving us that context. I think that's important, especially for listeners who might just need that little reminder that this is absolutely critical work. So, Ben, moving over to you now. As you know, the Climate Superfund Act passed last year and became law. And so I'm wondering where we're at with implementation. What has been done since then?
Yeah. So there's a couple of big things I mentioned, and then one legislative report, the reports from the Agency of Natural Resources to the legislature that I want to touch on briefly. So the first thing that's really the furthest along in terms of the implementation of the law is something called the Resilience Implementation Strategy. So that's something that the Agency of Natural Resources and the Treasurer's Office announced actually shortly before this legislation was introduced. Essentially, it's going to be, and again, they're fairly far along. They'll have a draft ready this summer, a prioritized plan for climate resilience and adaptation and what we need to do to prepare to respond to the disasters that are going to be hitting the state in the future. So again, that was work they were going to do anyway. It's work that the state should be doing. It became part of the Climate Superfund Act because these are the sorts of things that we should be funding with the money that would come in from this law. Again, this isn't about cutting carbon pollution. We have lots of other ideas on that. There are other episodes where we covering that in a lot of detail. It's about resilience, adaptation, and response. Everything from building more resilient roads and bridges to bolstering wetlands and riparian zones so floods aren't so bad, to swift water rescue teams when floods actually do happen inevitably. So really exciting to see them doing that work. And certainly, obviously, we hope that this money will come in and we'll be able to fund a lot of that work so that Vermont is in a much better position as climate disasters, come at us in the future. The next thing that's happened, which really is integral to the Climate Superfund Act, is the beginnings of what the Treasurer's Office and ANR were tasked with under the law. So the Treasurer's Office is required to estimate the costs of the climate crisis, specifically the emissions from fossil fuels over the last 30 years to the state of Vermont. And that's costs in terms of direct damage being done to the state because of all the effects of the climate crisis. And, flooding is very front of mind for Vermonters, but it's also extreme heat, higher average heat, diseases like Lyme and anaplasmosis becoming much more common here, and on and on and on. And so they're supposed to get their hands around as much of that cost as they possibly can, and the cost to adapt to become more resilient. The sort of work that's being looked at in the resilience implementation strategy. And then the Agency of Natural Resources, they're tasked with figuring out which companies actually have that connection to Vermont, and what each of them would be sort of on the hook for, what the cost recovery demand would be to each of these companies. And so late last year, the Agency of Natural Resources, in coordination with the Treasurer's Office, put out what's called an RFI. It's essentially the first step towards ultimately hiring contractors to do this work, because obviously, climate attribution science is a very mature field, but still relatively new, and so not something the state has in-house expertise on. And so they put out that request for information last year and got a lot of great responses from teams around the country, actually international teams as well, of academics who really described the methodologies that could be used by the state to estimate those costs. And then the last thing that I'll mention is the Agency of Natural Resources put out a report to the legislature as required by the law, and it was supposed to look at the feasibility of doing this work. And essentially, the message was, we've looked into it, we have these great responses to our request for information, and this is very doable work. Again, estimating costs like this is a relatively new field, but the Treasurer's Office and ANR were very clear in that report that this is feasible and the state absolutely should proceed with the law. And then the last thing, and this isn't something that's happened yet, but it should be happening very soon, so I'll mention it. The next step after that request for information is a request for proposals, an RFP that the Treasurer's Office would be putting out that would essentially say, if you think you can do this work, and again, there are multiple teams that have made clear that they could, then tell us, how much that would cost and what the scope of work you could accomplish for that would be. So that, should be coming out, we've heard, in the next few weeks, maybe a month or two at the outside, and is really going to get the ball rolling on that cost estimate. And again, that cost estimate is essential to this endeavor, because that number that it's going to come up with when you add up all these different costs, it certainly is going to be in the billions of dollars. We don't know exactly how big, but that's the number that the Agency of Natural Resources is ultimately going to use to determine how much company X or company Y, these large multinational fossil fuel companies, are going to be on the hook for. How large is the bill we're sending them?
Got it.
Can I just add one thing about the Treasurer's work? Even if we were never going to collect a penny from the largest fossil fuel companies bearing the biggest responsibility for the climate crisis, that work is still critical. And actually, the work goes beyond just attributing cost to them. And there's a piece of that work that looks at all-in climate costs, because we know that fossil fuels being the largest part of the climate crisis, but there are other factors. It's kind of crazy to think that Vermont hasn't wrapped its head around how much climate is costing us, because we have in the debates about mitigation, we're always hearing about, we can't afford, it's unaffordable to mitigate for climate. Well, the reality is that, because we've failed to mitigate for so long, we're paying one way or the other. So it's important for budget writers to know. It's important for us to keep in context when we have these conversations about the value that's provided by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, so that damages aren't as significant as they could be in the future if we stuck with business as usual. So just want to emphasize that the Treasurer's work is absolutely, as Ben said, critical to getting fair share cost recovery from the fossil fuel corporations, but it's also just an important piece of information for Vermont to have as we look at the challenges that climate crisis will bring fiscally to our state in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for lifting that up, because I think that's an important point. And overall, I feel like that's a really great update and sounds promising. But of course, I do have to acknowledge the fact that big oil is taking on Vermont right now with the lawsuit. So, Anthony, I know there's probably only so much you can share about an active, ongoing lawsuit, but I do think that our listeners would be really happy just to hear any kind of update that you can offer.
Sure. Well, one of the things that was interesting about the work that Ben and I and others did last year to try and get this law passed is it was one of these situations where everybody in the room understood that big oil, which has tried at every opportunity, and the large fossil fuel companies that goes beyond just oil, deny accountability, to reject attempts to hold them financially accountable for the damage that their products and activities have caused to society at large. So there was a knowledge when we were advocating for this law last year that if we passed the law, a legal challenge was very likely. And the good news about that is that myself, being a lawyer who's litigated many climate or environmental and climate cases, as well as law professors from around the country, other successful environmental trial lawyers, like we all came in to help the legislature say, here are the likely things that they are going to bring up in a lawsuit, and here are the reasons why we think we can prevail. So it was a really interesting experience to be lobbying from the standpoint of how do we build a bill that is meant to withstand numerous constitutional challenges from the fossil fuel industry. And in fact, it's not a surprise that they came forward after the bill was passed. Now, the interesting thing is none of the fossil fuel corporations themselves have sued Vermont. Instead, they're hiding behind their trade associations, the American Petroleum Institute and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to bring forward exactly the kind of claims that we anticipated when we were building this law up. Right now, not much has happened in the lawsuit, but action will be unfolding over the course of the spring. There's a schedule being set in place. And just so your listeners can understand, like, one of the key arguments that they make is that this law is preempted by the Federal Clean Air Act, that the Clean Air Act is occupies the whole field of climate regulation such that there's no room for individual states like Vermont to take its own action in a way that would, in their allegations, upset the federal primacy in terms of dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. And it really goes to a point that Ben just alluded to, which is this law is very different from the Clean Air Act because it's not about controlling emissions. Right. This is about dealing with the damage from emissions that have already happened as a result of the products and activities of some of the world's largest fossil fuel companies. So, number one, the two laws do very different things, which is unusual when you're arguing that one law preempts the other when literally they're sort of ships passing, if you will. But the second piece to understand is that at the same time as they're saying, oh, no, the Clean Air Act will take care of all of this, the Trump administration is rapidly eroding what the Clean Air Act actually covers in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, one of the things that they've proposed is removing what's called the so-called endangerment finding, which basically is the legal foundation that allows the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases in the first place. So it's quite a paradox to see the lobbyists for the fossil fuel companies like succeeding in their agenda to get the Trump administration to completely strip away greenhouse gas emission regulation when it comes to the Clean Air Act, but then somehow arguing that the Clean Air Act is so broad in terms of its coverage of greenhouse gas emissions that it even trumps our ability as a state of Vermont to protect the health and welfare of our citizens by collecting climate damages for emissions that have happened in the past. So that's kind of what's queued up. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but Vermont is not alone in the crosshairs of big oil when it comes to legal action. The state of New York has also followed Vermont's lead in passing a climate Superfund bill, and they have been sued as well. So the good news for Vermont, given that we're small relative to the power of these corporations, is that in the legal arena, we have a very powerful neighbor and ally in the state of New York.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to hear. And you did allude to this already, and I think it makes sense to go there now, is talking about New York and these other states that are trying to develop their own climate superfunds as well. There is some multi-state collaboration happening there, which I think is great. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about these states doing this work and how they're all faring at the moment. I know you mentioned New York, they're dealing with their own lawsuit, but it's my understanding that there are other states involved as well.
Yeah, I mean, the New York passing the law was really exciting because it came fairly close on the heels of Vermont, and New York had started this process ahead of us. In fact, when Ben and I and others were looking for models for Vermont's climate superfund, we referred a lot to what New York's bill had been that had passed the assembly but had sort of stalled in the Senate. And then it was Vermont going over and overtaking them that I think was a real big, important factor in New York legislator and their governor having the courage to follow suit. So there's an opportunity now for not just the lawyers defending these laws, but the scientists and the professionals at the state level who are trying to go about implementing them to cooperate and to pool resources. So that's an exciting opportunity. Ben and I have had the opportunity to also consult with advocates across the country on following suit of Vermont and now New York. And the interest in this, there had been interest pre-existing in California. Of course, last year's devastating wildfires. We shouldn't say wildfires at this point. They're forest fires that are caused by climate change. There's nothing wild about them. There is at the root cause, there is, human activity and products like the fossil fuel corporations' products and activities. But in any case, the devastating fires that that LA experienced have really increased interest in this as in a climate superfund for California to help them recover from the various damages that they're facing in the climate crisis. And Ben has worked with another number of other advocates. Maybe you could round out the list of states that is on this list, because it's getting pretty long and it's hard to keep track.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure I'd have every single one in my head because it is quite a number at this point. Before I get into that, I want to say just a little bit about it's been interesting talking to advocates and legislators, in some cases in other states that are advocating for laws like this one. I do think what Anthony said about the fact that, Vermont did go first, obviously, that's no secret, but that has had some kind of a snowball effect, or at least, proving the concept for other states. So, making other states more likely. Yep. But as in Vermont, each one of these states, they're not interested in going forward because, that's a cool policy that like those people in Vermont did. Every single one of these states is grappling with severe, dramatic, very human impacts of the climate crisis. Talking about the heat domes, out west in Oregon and Washington, wildfires in New Jersey, coastal erosion, et cetera, et cetera. So, sometimes people suggest, something needs to be done because we could be a leader. Certainly, I don't think there's any good reason not to be a leader. But when legislators here were talking about this law, they were very clearly talking and thinking about the just devastating floods in particular that had happened the summer before. And that's exactly the same sort of, catalyst that we're seeing in these other states. But to get to the question, I know New Jersey, their law, bill, not a law yet, has passed one or maybe two committees. California, as Anthony mentioned, they had a bill that passed through their state senate, I believe it was, last year. That's been picked back up in earnest in the wake of those fires in the Los Angeles area. Maryland, it looks like, is moving forward with a cost assessment similar to ours, and would be pursuing something like the actual Superfund Act in a subsequent legislative session. You've got Rhode Island looking into it. Oregon has a bill that's been introduced. Massachusetts, Minnesota. And I know there are advocates in a number of other states that are also looking into it. So, it is, I think, not surprising in some ways, but very heartening to see so many states looking at this as every state is grappling with the effects of the climate crisis.
Yeah, and with the federal government leaving states to their own, not just with the FEMA, but FEMA funds are not enough to deal with the myriad effects that Ben just laid out of the climate crisis. So it's no surprise. I think it's a really important point that Ben made. It's not just people trying to make headlines. It's people trying to bring relief to communities, individuals, businesses that are really suffering financially while these corporations are enjoying record profits year after year. So that, I think, is the motivating factor. It is just that Vermont being first was kind of a proof of concept, as Ben indicated.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's tragic that it has come to this and we need so many states to get involved, but it is heartening to see that we can come together. We're doing this as a unit, and that feels really special and important. And I always love to underline that Vermont was the first to do it because our brave little state is just so impressive, and I talk about it at every chance I get. But Ben, I would love to close out with the local perspective, bringing it back to Vermont. I'm curious if there's anything being done right now at the State House that is relevant to this discussion, and if so, if there's any way for our listeners to get involved and to help support the Climate Superfund cause.
Absolutely. So the one thing that I would highlight, which really is absolutely essential, is the request for funding that the Treasurer's Office and the Agency of Natural Resources have put on the table. So they received some initial funding for this last year to sort of get the ball rolling. That was obviously very early days. They hadn't put out the RFI that I mentioned earlier at that point. And so they came into this legislative session with very clear asks for additional funding for consultants, and each entity, that is the Treasurer's Office and the Agency of Natural Resources, requested one staffer to help sort of manage this project in their respective departments. And so, we're going into the legislature and very strongly supporting that. Obviously, if that funding doesn't happen, then this law can't move forward in practical terms. Maybe they can make some very small incremental progress with the initial funding they had, but certainly they wouldn't be able to actually fully implement the law in order to, put those cost recovery demands on the table for these companies. So unfortunately, that funding is not in the House budget that's going to be debated on the floor of the House this week. That doesn't mean all hope is lost. This is actually a bill that started in the Senate last year. And so I think there's a very good chance that the Senate is going to take a hard look at that. And we certainly are going to be pressing them to fund the law's implementation. So I'd say, if our listeners are interested in this, think this is a good idea, calling up their legislators or the State House or emailing the legislators and saying, please fully fund the implementation of the Climate Superfund Act. That would be a huge help as we're doing our advocacy in the building. And for VPIRG members who are listening to this, certainly you're going to be hearing from us in the next week or two about that. I'm giving you an opportunity to get in touch with your legislators about that. And we're going to be making a full-throated defense of the implementation of this law in the state Senate in the coming weeks.
All right.
Yeah, I would just add, it's a rare situation where modest investment of state general fund dollars could unlock hundreds of millions and potentially billions of dollars of critical funding from outside sources. So it is an investment, but the potential payoff is really big. And I do also want to emphasize, and acknowledge, Jordan, you're here, of course, there would have been no lobbying effort without the incredible organizing effort that VPIRG and others engaged in, and you were a leader in that. And, getting us to the next step is also going to depend on people power. It's not just inside the State House game. If we want to wield power in the climate accountability movement inside the State House, we really need to build that power outside the State House. So just echoing what Ben said a moment ago and building on the amazing work that you did in the Big Oil Pay campaign, we need the people to come back into this process. And so it's a great time to be sitting here having this conversation with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. And the work continues. And I'm hoping our listeners will join in on the effort and we'll just make it all happen. So thank you so much for your time today. Ben, Anthony, I'll let you get back to it. I know it's super busy these days, but appreciate your time and thanks for keeping us updated.
And we go.